Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to host the webinar, the DIIS webinar today on Charles Kupchan's last book, Isolationism, History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Thank you for joining. Thank you for everyone here on the panel, because I'm not the only one here. My name is Stefano Guzzini. I'm a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies and a professor of government at Uppsala University and of International Relations and the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. And I'm joining two of my colleagues.
Do you want for me to say a few words about myself as well,
Yes.
Stefano? Yes. Okay. Well, I'm Vibeke Skov-Tjeldner. I'm a senior researcher at DIIS, where I run a research project on the world of the right. I'm also affiliated to the Center for Right-Wing Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And well, in terms, I suppose, of today's seminar, just a few keywords on my research profile would be that I have a long interest in what Charles will be talking about, particularly the very sort of historical roots, the Protestant Republican roots of American foreign policy and the links between American foreign policy and the public sphere.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rasmus Søndergaard. I'm also a senior researcher here at DIIS, recently started. My research focus on human rights and US foreign policy in particular. I recently published a book with Cambridge University Press on the human rights and US foreign policy during the Reagan era. I'm also interested in democracy promotion as a foreign policy tool. And so this book and this talk is very much within the field of my research, and I look forward to it.
Thanks very much. And it is a pleasure and honor to introduce to all of you Professor Charles Kupchan, although I'm not quite sure you need much of an introduction. But Charles Kupchan is Professor of International Affairs in the School of Foreign Service and Government Department at Georgetown University and a Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. From 2014 to 2017, he served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council in the Obama White House. He was also Director for Foreign Affairs on the National Security Council during the first Clinton administration. So we have a very distinguished speaker who has been both in and outside of the corridors of power within the Washington. And he has been publishing many books on US foreign policy and world order, including how enemies become friends and that there will be a no one's world in the 21st century, neither American nor Chinese nor anyone else's. Today, his talk will be about his last book on isolationism, in which he tries to tell us that we should actually return to some versions of isolationism for understanding where the US might be going in the foreseeable future. So thank you very much for accepting to join us for this webinar, and I invite you now. The floor is yours, Professor Kupchan.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I'm delighted to join you today and to have co-discussants that span the spectrum. We have a kind of an IR theorist in Stefano and two people who know a lot about American foreign policy and American history. So I really, I feel privileged to be able to discuss the book in this context, in this format, and thanks to the Danish Institute for organizing this. You know, I'm obviously speaking at a interesting moment in American history. Joe Biden supposedly won the election a few weeks ago. The sitting president of the United States has yet to acknowledge that, but you know, what the hell, we'll do the best we can here. I don't really want to talk about contemporary politics and the divide between Biden and Trump, Democrats, Republicans, polarization. But what I want to do is to some extent provide a historical and analytic backdrop to where we are today, and to ask the question, where are we likely to go in American foreign policy. And to just give you a quick sketch of where I'm going to head, I think we've seen two big, long periods in American engagement with the world. One that lasted from the beginning, 1789 until 1941. And that was an era in which the United States essentially held the world at bay, tried to stand aloof from the international system in order to protect the American experiment. And then a second period from 1941 until Trump, which was the opposite. The United States took the American experiment abroad in an effort essentially to enforce Pax Americana and to share with others the commitment to liberty and prosperity and freedom that the United States had believed itself to be engaging in. And now I think we're at the beginning of period 3, which for me is hopefully going to be some amalgam, some middle ground between the first long run of American foreign policy, which the United States essentially tried to keep the world at bay, the second period in which it tried to run the world. And now it seems to me the question is, will the United States be able to find that middle ground? Will it be able to step back, which is what the American people want, but without stepping away, which would, in my mind, leave the international system quite exposed and unstable. So to get to that conclusion, I want to do 3 things, and I'll try to be as brief here as possible because I really do want to leave time for the comments of my distinguished colleagues here, and also for those of you who are joining. I'm going to do 3 things very briefly. One is to tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book, where it came from, and in doing so, I'll give a quick overview of American history prior to Pearl Harbor. Second, I want to talk a little bit about American exceptionalism and its impact on US grand strategy. And then the third thing I'm going to do is talk about where we are today and why I think the core challenge is, as I said, finding the middle ground between doing too little, which is where the US was before World War II, and doing too much, which is where I think we have been over the last couple of decades. So in terms of the history, and obviously this will be oversimplification and a quick sketch, but perhaps it would be useful for me to share with you why I wrote this book. And in many respects, it goes back to the 1990s when I began to sense, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Clinton's reluctance to engage in Yugoslavia as it was falling apart, a rapid decline in the media's coverage of foreign affairs, both print media and broadcast media. I began to ask myself, might this robust internationalism that I grew up with wane now that the Cold War is over? Is the United States going to go back to a, not necessarily anything that would be called isolationist, but a default position, a political equilibrium in which it is no longer as deeply engaged in the world? And that's when I first began to think about this question. Then 9/11 comes along, and that inward turn stops. And again, we go out and we go into Afghanistan and Iraq, and everybody's focused on Islamic extremism and violence and Al-Qaeda. And so there's no turn inward, but there is, again, a turn back to the domestic agenda and to a sense that the United States needs to pull back when the wars in the Middle East don't go well. And so it was really around 2011, 2012, and the reaction to George W. Bush's wars that I said, you know what, I think I really do need to know more about America's era of isolationism and to know more about what this country was like before 1941. Because, you know, I'm someone who grew up during the Cold War. I went to graduate school and started teaching in the 1980s before the Berlin Wall fell down. So I was spoon-fed American internationalism and the history of American foreign policy after Pearl Harbor. And I knew very little about American history and grand strategy prior to Pearl Harbor. And when I began to read and go back to the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was quite a shock, because in many respects, the America First outlines that we've been living with during the Trump era were ever present. The isolationism, the unilateralism, the racism, the protectionism. These were core elements of America's approach to the world, basically from 1789 until 1941. During the 19th century, the United States expanded across North America aggressively, grabbed a big chunk of land from Mexico, tried several times to invade and annex Canada, but it went no further than the Pacific coast. And in many respects, Americans followed the advice of George Washington, who in 1796 in his farewell address said, the United States should have commercial connections with everyone, political connections with no one. Jefferson had a similar formulation, no entangling alliances. And just to give you a quick sense of how strong this view was, in 1778, the United States formed an alliance with France because it was losing the Revolutionary War. It reluctantly reached out to the French, and the French said, yes, we'll come to your assistance because we are fighting the British alongside you. And the French sent troops and arms and vessels across the Atlantic and effectively saved America's skin. The United States achieved independence largely because the French agreed to help them out. In 1793, not too long after the end of the Revolutionary War, Britain and France went to war again. The French reached out across the Atlantic and said to the United States, we are now again at war with our mutual enemy. How many ships and how many troops are you sending? And George Washington responded by issuing the Proclamation of Neutrality, in which he basically said to the French king, good night and good luck, you're on your own. And it was not until after World War II that the United States again agreed to form a military alliance. So 1793, when we reneged on the alliance with France, until after World War II, the 1940s, the US refused to have an alliance with another country. And in many respects, that set the stage for the decades that followed. Throughout the 19th century, refusing to accept any proposal, and there were proposals to expand into the Caribbean, in Latin America, in the Pacific. All of these proposals were shot down either by Congress or by the president. We finally get to 1898 when the United States decides to take Manifest Destiny, its unique experiment in liberty abroad. That does not go so well. We have a backlash against the United States because of imperialism, effectively. In 1898, the United States kicked the Spanish out of Cuba, but then went on to military occupation in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, and Americans generally rejected this because they said, we were told we were going abroad to spread Republican government and Christianity, and we have turned into an empire. And then Woodrow Wilson comes along shortly thereafter and takes a different approach, an idealist approach to internationalism. He says we're going to war in 1917 to save the world for democracy. He tries to take the US into the League of Nations. This idealist approach to internationalism fails. 3 times Woodrow Wilson tried to ratify the League of Nations in the Senate. 3 times the Senate said no. Woodrow Wilson then says, well, I may have failed in the Senate, but the 1920 election is a referendum on American engagement in the world. It's an up or down vote on the League of Nations. The Republican candidate, Senator Warren Harding, says, make my day. I stand for the policies of George Washington. I am against alliance. I am for America alone. And in that election in 1920, Warren Harding wins in one of the most lopsided elections in American history. And that really sets the stage for the 1920s and the 1930s, a period during which the United States retreated to hardcore hardcore isolationism. We know the story of what happened in Europe and Asia during the 1930s as the United States refused to enter the war to stop Nazism, fascism, until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. We then turned very quickly after Pearl Harbor to the beginning of Pax Americana. And here's where I want to talk a little bit about American exceptionalism and why isolationism ruled the roost for so long, and why there was a flip in 1941 to robust internationalism in the beginning of Pax Americana. One of the reasons that the United States was isolationist from 1789 until 1941, and let me caveat that claim by saying the US was a trading nation from the start, was very involved in commerce from the beginning. Oftentimes it sent warships to defend commercial interests, US citizens, US businesses abroad, but it never took on strategic commitments outside North America, which is how I define isolationism. And the US was culturally engaged. It had missionaries abroad, it had diplomats abroad, but again, it refused to engage strategically outside North America. One of the reasons that isolationism prevailed for so long is that it was a function of American exceptionalism. It was a function of a narrative that basically said, ambition abroad will come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home. And that in many respects was the core animating principle that motivated the United States to pursue policies of strategic detachment from the very beginning, from the founding era until Pearl Harbor. And one of the reasons that it was so politically powerful is that it came in different flavors. There was a geographic version, which said the US is surrounded by large oceans to the east and west. We should bank on natural security. There was a libertarian version that says that the United States is engaged in a unique experiment in political liberty at home. We should not compromise that experiment by building a large navy and a large federal government and a large army, which risks tyranny. There was a libertarian version abroad, which is that the United States is a country that needs to preserve its sovereignty and its freedom of action abroad. And we should not form alliances or pacts or enter international institutions because the US is going to chart its own path. It will not be an imperial power. It will not play by the European rules of the balance of power. We will be a path blazer. We will be the new Israel, the chosen nation, a country that is going to follow Enlightenment principles, not the principles of realpolitik. And there was a racist version. And from the very beginning, the United States saw itself as not just a unique nation politically, but a unique nation in ethnic and racial terms and religious terms. The US was populated largely by Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It was Anglo-Saxon Protestants that would bring the American experiment to fruition. And many of the debates in the 19th century about expanding into Latin America or the Pacific or other regions were knocked down because Americans did not want to admit into the Union individuals that were neither Christian nor white. And so there was a very strong racial element to American exceptionalism and to isolationism that continued right through the 1930s and to World War II. And I would point out that it had very strong anti-immigrant tones as well. The US is known as an immigrant nation, but beginning in the 1880s, the US began to pass legislation barring the arrival first of Asians, first Chinese, then other Asians. And then in 1924, after World War I, the 1924 legislation was the most draconian anti-immigrant legislation in American history, basically barring or reducing by 90% the influx of Southeastern Europeans, mainly Catholic and Jews, because of a desire to go back to an immigration policy that was focused on Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That legislation lasted until the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So this is all by way of saying that one of the strong ideological underpinnings of isolationism was this concept of American exceptionalism, which had geographic, political, and ethnic racial components. That then sets the stage for 1941 and the flip from an American foreign policy that was about keeping the world at bay to an American foreign policy that was about bringing the American experiment to others. And in some ways, the nature, the profound radical nature of the flip is a function of the fact that there was a black and white discussion in the United States. That is to say, the US would either stand aloof from the world, it would detach itself from corruption abroad, from autocracy, from illiberalism, or it would go out and make the world safe for American engagement and American democracy. And it's really that flip that occurred in 1941 with Pearl Harbor. The isolationists were silenced. The internationalists came to the fore. The Roosevelt administration put together what we now call liberal internationalism, which was a marriage of a realist approach that emerged in 1898 to projecting power abroad, the idealist version that emerged under Woodrow Wilson after 1914, and that was to project American ideals abroad. And Roosevelt really brought these two things together, bringing to American grand strategy a combination of the projection of power through international partnership and multilateral institutions. That's the formula that led to a robust and stable brand of American internationalism, beginning with World War II and running into the 21st century. Let me begin to conclude by saying a few things about where we are now. In my mind, the pendulum has begun to swing back. We started from the founding era through 41 with a firm commitment to isolationism, short detours in 1898 and 1917, then going back during the interwar era. The pendulum then swung to internationalism, which continued right through Barack Obama. And with Trump, in many respects, you see the beginning of an American approach to the world that looks a lot more like pre-Pearl Harbor than post-Pearl Harbor. The isolationism. Trump has been withdrawing from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. The unilateralism. Trump withdrew from the Climate Pact. He withdrew from the WHO. He withdrew from arms control agreements. He basically wanted to keep the United States out of international engagements. The protectionism, going back again to the early period of American history, the United States wanted fair trade, not free trade. The US was protectionist until after World War II. Trump has gone back to a foreign policy that is largely protectionist. And the racism as well has come back, with the United States under Trump becoming anti-immigrant, and there is a nativism to American politics that we really haven't seen, at least I have not seen in my lifetime. And many see the Trump era as a break, as a bolt from the blue, as something radically new. It is not. The isolationism, the unilateralism, the protectionism, the nativism, and the racism, they are all part of the American experience, but the American experience prior to 1941, not after 1941. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book is to expose Americans and others around the world to the degree to which the Trump America First policies do have strong roots in American history, in American identity, in an American political culture. My final comment is to simply speculate on where we are today and where Biden is likely to head. Biden is someone who has cut his teeth on the post-World War II internationalism that most of us are familiar with and that most of us hope will return. It's multilateral, it is open, it is free trade, it is multicultural, it is about partnership. And I think we will see Biden move in that direction immediately on January 20th, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, rejoining the WHO, trying to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal, reaching out to European allies and saying, we're back, we stand next to you in solidarity. But I do think what we'll see is a situation in which the pendulum will swing back, but only so far. And as I said at the beginning, my guess is that we're going to see Biden look for that middle ground, because the politics have changed here in the United States. The country is very inwardly focused, partly because of the pandemic, but more so because of the underlying economic uncertainty that the digital age has brought to Americans. We see Americans going back and worrying about what the founders said. Ambition abroad has come at the expense of liberty and prosperity abroad. The wars in the Middle East have cost over $6 trillion. They have produced little good. It is not just Trump's folks who want out of the Middle East. It is Democrats, Republicans, centrists, progressives. Pullback has gone mainstream. And so I think what we're witnessing here is the beginning of a new national narrative about how to find a balance between an American foreign policy that tried to do too much and an American foreign policy that aimed at doing too little. It's fascinating to me the degree to which our domestic debate has changed over the course of the past year. You now have Mearsheimer, Walt, others whose names might be familiar to, arguing that the US should go to offshore balancing, pull out of Europe, give NATO to the Europeans, go offshore in East Asia, pull out of the Middle East, come home America. It's not just academics, it's Trump. It's not just right, it's left. George Soros founded a new think tank with Charles Koch, a libertarian, called the Quincy Institute, which is about getting out of foreign wars. The Democratic platform called for ending wars in the Middle East. Some of Biden's advisors are talking about getting out. And so the key to me is how to make this transition happen in a paced way, in a measured way, in a judicious way. That's the debate that I think Americans and others need to have. And so I would end with simply offering 3 guidelines that I think should inform American foreign policy at this critical moment of transition. One is to focus largely on pullback from the periphery, from the Middle East. That's where the United States has overreached. That's where the Americans want out. Secondly, to concentrate on not expanding the liberal global order, the neoliberal order. That, to me, is partly what went wrong over the last several decades. We aimed to do too much. We threw open the West and in many respects overreached. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, to focus on our problems at home. Because it seems to me that if Biden is going to be not just a hiatus from Trump, but a long-term correction from Trump, we need to address the underlying problems. And those have to do with economic uncertainty. They have to do with immigration. They have to do with democratic institutions that have begun to stumble. I do think that the United States is exceptional in the sense that it has taken a unique path in history. But it seems to me that at this point, the key task before the United States is not to go out and spread its exceptional experiment abroad, but to refurbish that experiment and to go back to where the founders said the country should be. And that is as a country that serves as an example, as a model for others to follow, not a country that spreads its example through more zealous means. Stefano, I'm going to stop there and look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thanks very, very much. We have already some questions coming up from the audience as well, but I now turn to to Rasmus first for the first engagement and the first questions to you. Please.
Thank you, Stefano. And thank you, Professor Kupchan, for your talk, but also congratulations, first and foremost, on an excellent book. It is an impressive read. It is broad in scope, obviously the time span covered, but also I think worth noting the actors included along the way. It is incredibly well written, and I sympathize with your call for the middle course in US foreign policy. So I found a lot to like. And I definitely recommend it to everyone in the audience to rush out and buy yourself a copy if you don't have one already. That, of course, also makes my task a bit daunting to have to come and criticize on a piece of work that I think is so well conceived. But I will try and push back a little on a few of your arguments. But again, this is offered against the backdrop of as a really sort of impressed with the book at hand. I'll focus on three things. First, the terminology, the use of the word isolationism. Change and continuity in liberal internationalism. And finally, some of the stuff you commented on lastly in your talk, sort of more concrete policy prescriptions that you draw from the book. But as for terminology, one of your guiding questions in the book on page 8, and I quote, "How and why was isolationism able to maintain its hold on US statecraft from the founding fathers to the 1940s? So this question, of course, relies on an underlying assumption, which is that isolationism was dominant in US foreign policy in that period. And I don't mean to contest that, but I do want to question whether isolationism is the right term necessarily, and at least I would like to hear your thoughts on your choice, active choice to write a book around that term. Because you note yourself in the book that the term didn't come into popular uses until the 20th century. You also point out that sort of on the face of it, there are certain elements of US foreign policy in the 19th century that seems at odds with isolationism. And here comes the intervention in relation to that. Last week, I attended another webinar with Stephen Wertheim, which you cite in the book, and you just brought up the Quincy Institute here, of which he is affiliated. In his talk, he made the argument that you are probably familiar with, but he basically argued that narratives of US history as a contest between isolationism and internationalism are mistaken or somewhat misguided. And so with your book in mind, of course, I asked him if maybe his rejection of the term isolationism if maybe it comes down to his definition of the term, and probably shouldn't be surprised by his reaction, given, as you also show in your book, the stigma that's been associated with the term isolationism and the extent to which it has been misused in the past and the present to sort of delegitimize certain positions in the foreign policy debate. But so his response basically was that isolationism is not useful as an analytical term, and that it's ahistorical to apply it. And so I don't mean to suggest that I'm personally undecided on the matter, and I don't really have a dog in that fight. But obviously, having attended his webinar and now given the focus of your book, I do want to see if you have some thoughts to share on that issue. And relatedly, I want to tease out, could the book have been written, without using the term isolationism, possibly by using other terms such as Walter Russell Mead, his 4 schools of US foreign policy traditions. I mean, you also refer to that in the book. In that case, as Walter Russell Mead has suggested, Trump could be described as within his sort of Jacksonian tradition of populist values and military strength rather than isolationism. So to sum up, I'd like you to expand on your use of the term isolationism, the conscious choice you made to structure a book around that term, and respond to those who argue that the term isn't useful as an analytical concept for US foreign policy. So that's my first point. Second is I want to see if you could say a bit more about change and continuity in liberal internationalism from, basically 1941 until today. So I understand the focus of your book, as you also sketched here in your presentation, is very much on the history of isolationism pre-1941. But the period from 41 until 89, so the Cold War years, late World War II and then the Cold War years, they get 19 pages in your book. I feel like I counted it up to. And Reagan, who is my own research interest, I think he's afforded a mere sort of 1 paragraph, half a page in that chapter at least. So obviously we always want to hear more about our own research interests. And so I want to sort of humbly suggest that maybe that section could be expanded, and maybe you can say a bit more about it here. You give a bit more space for the post-Cold War period, but I would still say also Bush, Clinton, Bush. It's relatively brief, your treatment there. And you make 2 key arguments in those chapters, as I read it. First, with regards to the Cold War, you say that although you acknowledge differences between administrations, you call it minor strategic adjustments, your main argument there is still that you stress continuity in the bipartisan commitment to the liberal international order during the Cold War. Conversely, when we look at the post-Cold War era, you stress differences between Republican and Democratic administrations. You argue that Republicans have tended to embrace an approach of power, you could also say unilateralism, whereas Democrats have tended to be more focused on partnerships or multilateralism. This is a somewhat sort of sketch I'm outlining here, but I feel like that's the gist of it. And so I wonder, is it possible that you are overstating the continuity across Cold War administrations and overstating maybe the partisan differences in the post-Cold War era just a little bit? And moreover, I see much continuity across the late Cold War period, which is what I work with, and the early post-Cold War period. And I want to point to a few things before moving on to my final point. There is continuity across political parties, the way I see it. For instance, say Bush Senior and Obama, the way I see it, at least, they pursue a sort of pragmatic, restrained internationalism, which then goes against the argument that Republicans and Democrats are supposedly, obviously others are more diverging from each other, but there are some commonalities there, at least between Bush Senior and Obama with regards to American commitment to internationalism. And also continuity across the Cold War and into the post-Cold War eras. Just 2 points from Reagan. Reagan-Clinton, I see a great deal of continuity in their shared commitment to the promotion of democracy and capitalism. And for Reagan-Bush Jr., there is this shared preference for, as you outlined, the sort of power over partnerships, skepticism of multilateralism, the United Nations, international law, etc. So with that in mind, I just want to give you the chance to elaborate a bit on the book's treatment of liberal internationalism during the Cold War and beyond, and ask if maybe you want to comment on these points about change and continuity across the Cold War and post-Cold War divide, and possibly also the partisan divide that you sketch out in the post-Cold War era. Then my last point. For the policy prescriptions. So you talk of this middle course, you discuss it in the book and you mention it now in your presentation. You suggest that the US needs to strike a balance between isolationism and an overstretched internationalism to arrive at this middle course. You contrast the vice of what you label it sort of a dangerous retreat with the virtue of a judicious retrenchment. And you just, in your talk again, you gave the sort of three guidelines, the broad guidelines that you give for what a judicious retrenchment might look like. But I would like you to maybe comment on what it could look like in practice for the incoming Biden administration on current issues. It could be the situation in Belarus, could be how to deal with Hong Kong, or implications for Europe and NATO. I'll leave it up to you to choose any of these cases or any other cases you might find illustrative. But I just wanted to maybe hear you say a little bit about some concrete cases. And related to that, this is my final point, there is this current debate going on, obviously, that I'm sure you're intimately familiar with, but basically whether Biden, on the one hand, should pursue a restoration or reform of US foreign policy. So restoration, just for the audience, would essentially mean a return to the status quo before Donald Trump, a commitment to liberal international order, the US is the indispensable nation, etc. And I would say that this is the establishment position or the centrist position in the Democratic Party. And on the other hand, we have the call for reform, which would require a hard look at some of the shortcomings, perceived shortcomings in US foreign policy, over-reliance on militarism, neoliberal economic policies, and failure to comply with international law on certain occasions. And this would be the revisionist position or the progressive position in the Democratic Party. So I would invite you to share, I mean, I have my own ideas based on reading the book, but if you could share, where would you put your proposed middle course in this debate between restoration and reform? So that does it for me, and I look forward to your responses. Thank you.
Stefano, do you want me to respond now, or do you want the other commentators to? No, go, okay. Erasmus, those were really excellent comments. Thank you. And thank you for reading the book so closely. In fact, I think you read it too closely. You have found little places that obviously require further discussion. You know, on your first point, I'll answer both in substantive terms and in terms of kind of discourse and the pros and cons of using the term. Substantively, I would just disagree with Stephen and others who think that isolationism is the wrong word, in the sense that it wasn't, as you correctly pointed out, the US didn't see itself as isolated. And that's part because it was not. The British and the French and the Spanish and the Russians were all part of the Western Hemisphere. Native Americans were pressing in. So the founders and those that came after didn't sense the US as being isolated, but they wanted that, right? They aspired toward a geopolitical situation in which they were isolated from other great powers and from threats to the territorial well-being of the United States. And yes, there was a lot of trade. Yes, there were Americans going abroad, but there really was a sense of aspiration to geopolitical detachment and the emergence of a Western Hemisphere that would be separated geopolitically from the rest of the world, that to me does connote the idea of isolation. And you know, as you know, I define it very much in narrow terms as a strategic doctrine that says we should stay home, we should protect the mothership, but not go further. And that is a definition that I think that I put out there by means of having the debate that you and I are having. Is it the right choice? I think that one of the reasons that Stephen and the Quincy Institute and others don't like the term is because it is a pejorative. It's because it has all this baggage. They don't want to be called isolationists. They are isolationists, right? They actually do want the United States to return to hemispheric isolation. They just don't want to use that term because they know it will isolate them politically. And so, I understand that, but precisely because the word does carry that baggage and does generate the kind of debate that it does, for me as an author, it was attractive, precisely because I knew that it would stimulate the kind of debate that it has. Do I have some regrets about it? Yes, and that's because reviewers and Stephen and others have focused on, well, was it the right term? Was it not the right term, rather than the substance? And so is there a downside? Yes, because it turns into a bit of a food fight over terminology rather than a serious discussion about the substance. But I guess on balance, I probably would make the same decision I did if I had to do it all over again, precisely because the term does carry the historical weight that it does. On continuity and change in internationalism, you're right that I gave short shrift to American internationalism, and I did that in part because this is a book about the alternative. This is a book about isolationism, and isolationism, as we've been talking about, it really does die out in the early 1950s. There was a push by Senator Taft, by Senator Bricker, by a few others to go back to isolationism and to keep the US out of Asia and Europe, but it really does run out of gas in 53, 54. And other than Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul and a few others, it's just not part of the political discourse in the United States, including after the Vietnam War. And that's one of the reasons that I tried to move relatively quickly through that history. Furthermore, that's a history that many people know a lot about. And my own view was that the value added of the book is really to tell the story that comes before Roosevelt, not the story that comes after Roosevelt. In terms of your characterization of what happens in the 1990s and thereafter, I would agree with you that there wasn't that much difference between George H.W. Bush and Obama, but that's because George H.W. was the last hurrah of centrist, moderate Republican internationalism of the sort that emerged in the 1940s and in the 1950s. And it was really in 1994, when the Republicans won the midterms, that you begin to see the party different kind of foreign policy, and you see the center collapse and the bipartisan coalition behind liberal internationalism dissolve. And to some extent, Clinton, you like to say that they were committed to those earlier principles, but the Republicans, by the time of Clinton and Obama, were not on board. And that's why I call Obama kind of liberal internationalism light, but he had a very difficult time, in part because the Republicans were not there. The other point I would make is that I think that, yes, you're right to say that there were differences between Republicans and Democrats during the Cold War. So let's compare Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan. But the presence of the Soviet Union and the continuation of the Cold War was in some respects a kind of, it channeled Democrats and Republicans alike to similar policies. Once the Cold War was over, those barriers were gone. And as a consequence, there was a lot more variation in policy as we switched from party to party during the last couple of decades. On policy, you know, I would say that I'm for reform and I'm not for restoration. And that's because we need more than restoration, right? It's difficult for me to overstate the degree to which we have had a near-death experience here in the United States. I'm a Democrat. I'm a Biden supporter. I was elated by the outcome, but I'm also exhausted, and I am distraught. I never thought I would live through 4 years in the United States in which the president is a liar, in which the president violates on a daily basis the guardrails of American democracy, in which Americans are walking into Walmart and synagogues and shooting people because they are not white or Christian. I mean, this has just been the most distressing political era of my life. And for me, it is a huge warning. And that warning is that there are a lot of angry people in this country, and there are a lot of people who are willing to vote for someone who's unfit for office because he taps into that anger. And what that says to me is that we desperately need to figure out what went wrong, and we need to correct what went wrong, because otherwise the angry illiberalism, the angry populism that we've been living with here in the US, and you have it in Europe, it just has not been as dominant, will prevail. It will triumph. And so for me, the top priority of the Biden administration is figuring out where the anger comes from, figuring out a policy, both a domestic policy and a foreign policy, that brings back good wages, that brings back employment, that brings back security to average Americans. And one of the things that I think will do that is to lighten the load of American foreign policy abroad. That's what the American people want. And so for me, we do need an overhaul. We do need a reform. We do need a new way forward. Because if we go back to business as usual, I fear that the Biden era will be short-lived, and that we will again be facing the kind of strange, dangerous, ugly politics that I and my fellow Americans have been living with for the last 4 years.
Thank you, Charles. Vibeke?
Thank you. Charles, I too want to begin by thanking you for your book, and not just the good read that it is, but also the many ways in which it explains, I think, what is currently taking place in American foreign policy, but also what happened during sort of the height of robust internationalism in American foreign policy. Because I think from a European perspective, if people do not take an interest in the centuries that went before the 1940s, it's difficult to understand why, even in those years of internationalism, America always had impulses that ran against international bureaucracy, the forms of multilateralism that became too institutional, too bureaucratic, and so on. I also think that just in terms of contemporary affairs, when Europeans try and understand what's happening in the US outside of Washington, for instance, what's going on in Silicon Valley, it's impossible to understand how a now very powerful part of American politics and American political life can both want to reform and innovate the world, but is also, as Silicon is, so instinctively libertarian or instinctively against, international regulation of tech and a number of the other issues that it cares about. So I think the book explains much more than just what went before and what might come after Trump. It explains to us why there were always paradoxes in liberal internationalism, and it explains many other facets, I think, of American political life today, or an American culture, broadly speaking. So for Europeans who only took an interest in the post-45 period, I would say that this is a must-read in terms of understanding why the American approach to global order, international cooperation, alliances, and so on, are just inherently different from many European approaches. So that's sort of my basic recommendation to anyone for reasons for reading the book. I think I will also say before I post, because I have obviously some specific questions for you and things I'd like your comments, like for you to reflect on. But for you to understand those questions, maybe I should say one or two sentences about my own approach to some of these issues and why I've been interested in the period that you too take an interest in, the early part of American political life and the Protestant and Republican philosophies or ideologies that went into shaping early American foreign policy. Because when I first came to American foreign policy, the study of American foreign policy, I came with some very, very critical eyes. I came out of critical security studies, and all I could see was nativism and an ugly exceptionalism, imperialism, and so on. And then the more I read, and the more I took an interest in some of the figures that your book opens with, the founding fathers and so on, I realized that there was something else there as well. That there was an exceptionalism that said, yes, there was one exceptionalism that is, yes, messianic, self-aggrandizing, but there's also another exceptionalism. There are many exceptionalisms, as you started out presenting in your book. But if we take a particular look at the one that had to do with America as a place that believes it's got special ideas for the world, I realized that there was an exceptionalism there in the sort of founding Republican principles that didn't say America is exceptional because it is perfect and is run by perfect men. No, America is exceptional because it has understood that human beings are imperfect. And that's why you need to create forms of governance that keeps those imperfections in check. And in that respect, it was founded on sort of a form of foreign policy that always had restraint, self-restraint, reflexivity, thinking against yourself as part of the equation. So this wasn't the impulse that always sort of steered American foreign policy forward. It certainly wasn't, but I understood that that is also part of the tradition. And that has been the part of the American foreign policy tradition that I've taken a particular interest in. And I've been particularly interested also in the early years of your robust internationalism, those early years of shifting from isolationism to internationalism, because I think, I understand why your book is not primarily about that period, but I think if you dive into the first decade or so of sort of the immediate post-45 period, I think some of the debates there with figures like Reynold Niebuhr and Arthur Schlesinger, George Kennan, Hans Morgenthau, and so on, I think they did try and return to the early period, the early sort of the basic Republican principles, and try to think through, like, could it be possible? Was it possible to wage a restrained internationalist and engaged foreign policy? They lost that battle, but there was a debate there. And so that, just to explain to you that this is where I'm coming from, and some of my questions will sort of come out of that perspective. Because the first thing I wanted to ask you was, in your introduction to the book, you present Obama and Trump as steps towards a disengagement, as sort of Obama taking the first steps of retreat, and Trump going the vulgar route of nationalism, but ultimately finishing in on steps already taken by Obama. And you pose it very much as a question of dosage, how much, how little to do internationally. But I would like to ask you, do you not think that it is impossible to distinguish between those different forms of exceptionalism that I noted, or that I just talked about previously? If you want to understand how different Obama and Trump have come to this question of retreat, because I would say from the Trumpian perspective, which plugs into some of your nativist impulses in a previous isolationist tradition in America, in American foreign policy, it's simply about, like, why spend on a world that can deal with its own problems? Perhaps a critique of a material and military overstretch, but one that is ultimately instrumental. Whereas I think Obama was trying in some ways to plug into that other form of Republican restraint that I talked about. Like, he was critical of an America that had not just stretched itself materially, but had betrayed some principles of understanding its own fallibility and its own biases and its own, that had somehow convinced itself that it knew it all. So do you also think that there is some value in understanding not just where one lands in terms of dosage, how much to do, but that it matters from what perspective one wants to cut back or isolate or retreat? That I suppose is my first question. And it leads to a second question, which has to do with something that you said in your introduction that you'd rather not talk about, mentioned briefly in your comments to Rasmus, namely the state of contemporary American politics domestically. I don't want for you don't have to say a sentence more about Trump, but wouldn't you say that it is impossible to return to the kind of judicious restraint that the founders that you, as you describe it in the book, that they had in mind? If you do not, like, can you secure that kind of judicious perspective if you don't have a well-functioning democratic culture? That is in terms of checks and balances between, the executive and the legislative and so on, but it is also within key government institutions, within the military, within the state apparatus, like a healthy democratic culture of pluralism and, constructive partisanship. Because wasn't it part of that initial ideal that one had to have the mechanisms of keeping, overstretch at bay for different branches of government to think against the others and to check the others and to, a pluralism of ideas keeping each other in check somehow. So can America have forged a healthy judicious isolationism, or whatever you want to call it, like retreat position moving forward, if it doesn't restore the healthy pluralism and institutional balance of its domestic political structures? Is that possible? And there, I think something that I've noted and quoted you for many times in the past, but it's something I've noted that you take an interest in is the link between foreign policy and the public sphere, that having a grand strategy that doesn't resonate somehow with fundamental outlooks and perspectives of the public just doesn't work, no matter how well conceived it might otherwise seem to be. And there I wonder if something has changed. Like, I personally thought that Obama formulated a position of judicious retreat that convinced me, but it didn't convince his public, and it didn't convince many of his contemporary or his political adversaries, even some of his political peers. Is that because something has changed over the past centuries? Is sort of the conditions of foreign policy in a sort of the Twitter democracy of the 21st century, do they somehow not sustain that you can have a wise and judicious foreign policy? If you could say something about that, so you don't have to say a word about Trump, but just those more sort of systemic conditions of American foreign policy today that exist on these new immediate terms. And then I have just two quick questions about that has more to do with forward-looking, implementing the type of strategy. I know your book is not a long outline of where you want for the US to be heading. It is first and foremost a historical overview, but you do land on a few, recommendations for where you both sort of prophesize that the US will be heading and also advise that it should nudge its foreign policy in the direction of. And there I'm thinking, you do not recommend, though you foresee a return to some form of isolationism, or at least a retreat from a very interventionist position or internationalist position. You do not foresee a US that can simply turn its back on the world. So the US will still have to sell a judicious retreat somehow to its public. And when I read through Biden's foreign affairs article, what I see there is an outline of policy problems, not so much China and Russia and so on, but policy problems like climate change, the regulation of global finance, regulation of global migration streams, regulation of big tech, like challenges that all involve so much governance, so much bureaucracy, so much, of the worst, with the American isolationist perspective, form of international cooperation, because it's big institutions, it's all of the things we don't like somehow. And do you think that it will be possible to sell a foreign policy which may retreat from military engagements, but pushes the US into, enormous multilateral governance structures if these problems are to be addressed globally? And I don't suppose they can be addressed in any other way, because they have to be solved collectively. And secondly, I just thought it would be great to hear you say a few things about the aspect of Biden's foreign policy that has to do with his alliance of democracies, and this, he has somehow advertised that this is something he wants to reactivate somehow. And that is one of the areas where I see a difference between him and Obama in some ways, because Obama had this skepticist approach to perhaps the US had not been listening enough, and had been a little too self-aggrandizing in its belief that it could export democracy to all parts of the world, not least Eastern Europe. And what we're witnessing in Eastern Europe these days, I think, is a response to some of that. I don't know if you've read Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes' book, The Light That Failed, on sort of Eastern Europe and its reaction to American exceptionalism in a sense. But I think that book sort of goes into the kind of backlash that the Pax Americana's experience, and in one of the key parts of the world where that entire internationalist project, I mean, in some ways, I consider Eastern Europe like the crown jewel in the American liberal nationalist project. And now it's sort of saying, no, thank you, we don't want that anyway. That was a mistake. So could you just say something about where you, well, how you view this problem, which is in a sense, I suppose, also the tragedy of American diplomacy? Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Charles.
Thank you, Vibeke. Those were amazing comments, very, very perceptive, very probing. As with Rasmus, I feel privileged to have such good commentators. Just a couple of initial responses. First, you began your comments by saying, Europeans should read this because they need to know about what came before. I have to say mea culpa in the sense that this was an eye-opener for me. You have read, early American history and the founders. I'm someone who went to, grad school, read all about the Cold War. And I have to say, when I sort of started reading American grand strategy in the 19th century and early 20th century, my head exploded. It was like, what am I reading about? What country is this? This is not the United States. And that's because it was so different from what I was used to, right? You grow up here in the US, you live in a fishbowl of Pax Americana and liberal internationalism and multiculturalism, and then you sort of go back and you read what came before, and it's just there's no resemblance. And so I really, if anything, if I take away anything from this book and working on the book, it's that when we have these discussions, let's talk about the United States from 1789 to 2020. Not 1941 to 2020. Because if you start the clock in 1941, you don't get it. You will miss too much about what this country is and how it evolved. So I completely agree with you on this. And as I said, I started this book before Trump was elected. And then when he gets elected, and he gives a speech on Inauguration Day where he says it's America first, right? And I had just spent, the previous week reading about the America First Committee in 1940. It's like, wow. And it's interesting to me that this all happened because Trump doesn't read books, right? He's not somebody who is steeped in American history, but he has an uncanny political sensibility. And what he was doing is tapping into this strain in American political culture and in the American political narrative that left me quite impressed with him. I mean, I'm not a Trump fan, but we dismiss him at our peril. He's a very talented politician who knew how to pull certain strings in the American electorate. The second quick comment is that I like the way that you unpacked the contradictions in American exceptionalism and your own personal journey from being a critical theorist to someone who realized that from the very beginning there were two sides to the coin. Because on the one hand, if you go back and you look at the founding era in the 19th century, it's awful in the sense that the United States trampled on Native Americans, practiced slavery, took huge swath of Mexican territory, was racist, but at the same time really did see itself as a country that was engaged in a historically unique experiment. And the founders were, in many respects, dual-faced. They had what I would call extremely laudable instincts, and they had instincts that were disgraceful, particularly when we look back at them. Woodrow Wilson, we could have a debate whether Princeton should have dropped the name Woodrow Wilson from its school. Woodrow Wilson's a perfect example. Was he a racist? Yes. Was he an imperialist? Yes. Was he also someone who was putting out to the world principles that I think are laudable? Yes. And so there was within this one person characteristics and instincts that span the spectrum. That's just, to me, part of the American experience, and we have to admit the dark side, and we also, in my mind, have to accept the exceptionalist side and the side that is worth respect and worth honoring. Very quickly on your questions. Yeah, I think you've tapped into something interesting when it comes to Obama and Trump, in that I do, at the beginning of the book, treat them as extensions of each other, in the sense that Obama was a retrenchment president who tried to pull back, nation building at home. He had a lot of trouble, and then Trump comes in and implements what Obama tried to do, in part because Obama was frustrated, because ISIS came along and Afghanistan wouldn't let go. And so there is continuity in the story. But I also think that you're right to note that they operated on different conceptions of American exceptionalism. Obama did believe that, he really had a conception of American exceptionalism that was positive, in which the United States had bent the arc of history in the right direction. I think Trump, in many respects, was going back to a 19th century exceptionalism that was much more nativist, that was much more isolationist, that was much less about multiculturalism, and much more about this kind of conception of the United States as a white country, and that's why there was not particularly subtle pains to white supremacy and to nativism and racism. So I think you see in Obama and in Trump, in many respects, the two faces of the exceptionalist narrative that you rightly point out were there from the beginning. And the continuity that I see on the foreign policy front was in some respects completely separate from those two faces. Can we return to judicious retrenchment? I don't know. I think that you're right to say that in the world of Twitter and Facebook and Fox versus MSNBC, it's going to be very hard to restore a kind of common narrative. We really do live in a country of alternative realities, and we see that by the degree to which right now, the most recent poll that I saw indicated that 70% of Republican voters believe that Trump won the election. 70%. 74 million voters backed Trump. And so this is not a country where we are seeing the center come back to life. And so how do we deal with that? That's the social media environment moving forward. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I do believe that the one thing that we can address is the underlying economic uncertainty that does, in my mind, serve as the platform for the erosion of the political center and the anger that we see roiling the American public. And, you know, in large swaths of the country, people are not making ends meet, particularly in ex-urban and rural areas of the country. Communities are dying. Kids can't find work. Parents are working 2 jobs back to back and they're making minimum wage and they can't put food on the table. And so to me, that's something that is solvable. It's not easy to solve, but I do think that we do need to have a real push on that front and figure out the future of work in the digital age. To me, that is the big question, because if we don't deal with that and we don't deal with the underlying economic insecurity and the difficulty making ends meet, my answer to your question of can we restore sensibility to democratic debate is probably no. Probably no. On your 2 questions about Biden and where he's going to head, in some ways, my answer to the question would be that if Biden can deliver on some of these economic issues, the pandemic, investment in infrastructure, bringing decent paying jobs to middle America, he can also resolve the issue of multilateral engagement. What Americans really object to is ongoing efforts to turn Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio. They're not working and they won't work and they cost over $6 trillion and a lot of lives. If we can kind of move off that, I think that the American public is willing to stand by reasonably ambitious foreign policy that maintains its core commitments in Europe and in Asia, and that Biden would not have a problem going back to multilateralism, to Paris, to the WHO, especially if he can make the case, which I think he can, that the United States cannot resolve global problems unless it returns to being a team player. And on democracy promotion, I think you're right that Biden's instincts are more forward-leaning than Obama's. I think the people around him, like Tony Blinken, tend to be more forward-leaning. But in the end of the day, I believe that they will gravitate to what I would call a pragmatic realism. And that's because they don't have a lot of choice, and because they realize that when it comes to democracy promotion, we have a lot of work to do here in the United States and in working with our core democratic partners. I'm not sure that there will be a lot of bandwidth or resources to worry about democracy promotion in Russia and China. On the contrary, I'm guessing that in the end of the day, a certain pragmatism will prevail, partly because the domestic agenda and the domestic priorities are for now overwhelming.
Thank you. That leaves me with a couple of questions. Thanks again for giving us the opportunity to discuss your book. And I will not spend lots of time, since we are running short of time, saying the nice things about the books. I will have some nice questions afterwards, but I think the advertisement has already been made, and I think really justifiably so. Made me think about a couple of things which I'd learned in my earlier days and which I needed to rethink time and again. Let me start with 2 comments, and which give a background for the kind of question I'm after, which is following up on Vibeke quite nicely, I think. The first comment is that a strategy coming back to good housekeeping is not new. It has come back regularly in the US in the debates. George Kennan had in the Right lectures asked his Americans to listen, even to learn from some of the socialist experiments about alphabetization and free schooling and so on. We had the debates in the 80s at the American Decline debates of the 80s, in which also good housekeeping was one of the things. Clinton won on "It's the economy, stupid." It's the we had Reich joining the Clinton administration on the work of nations, understanding that there is a need for making these domestic reforms. That has been going on for 50, 60 years. And we haven't been going anywhere close to doing these reforms. So it's the first comment, because it invites a kind of skepticism. Not that we shouldn't need them. I think everyone, or not everyone, but many would agree we need them. But the big question is, why is it that we haven't been able, or that the US hasn't been able to deliver on them, even if they had administrations initially trying to do so? The second is about not the wording of isolationism, but making us not forget the second part on which you insisted all the time, namely that this isolationism is a strategic limitation, but it meant a very not offensive in the bad sense, but it meant a very present foreign policy in terms of trade, pushing for free trade, pushing for open borders, be it in the early days in Japan, Asia, and whatever, but also in the later days. And the multilateralism that was built up was very much a multilateralism which was good for American capitalism, and that was meant to be. So the two things go together. There's on the one hand a certain retrenchment or self-restraint, but on the other hand there was a very strong presence in international economic affairs which should always profit the US. So when I listened to Trump, I sometimes had this impression that it was a gated community writ large for the US. So this idea that we could somewhat shelter, or that the US could shelter itself, and yet with a quite muscular at times home delivery service that needed to be done, and getting the goodies back in, and living out of the privilege of running the international reserve currency, which allows the US to run huge debts which don't cost as much as they would cost for anyone else in the world. So basically living off an international system economically was, or could be seen as, the condition for being able to run that what you call isolationism in the first place. So the two things are not just side by side, but that the one would be perhaps the condition for the possibility of the other, that the retrenchment needs at the same time a kind of economic internationalism that produces and makes sure that the US can stay economically rich enough and wealthy enough in order to do this kind of retrenchment at the same time. Now that, of course, doesn't sound the same way as the 6 trillion that have been spent in the Middle East, and I think that cut can be much easier than thinking about what should be the role of the United States in the international economic order in the foreseeable future when it does this retrenchment. Would it also retrench its positions in that economic order? If not, and then now come my questions, which are connected to this. So the first is that I really think that it is a very courageous exercise trying to get isolationism on the center front piece. And I think, if I might be misunderstanding the book, but I think what you do is to try to think that the only way we might have a chance to change US strategy is to contaminate it by that which it considers to be part of itself or part of the negative itself. So you need to actually get to a topic or to a concept that is crucial, that has been crucially around for a very long time. I mean, in some sense, it is interesting that the end of the book, of course, the interest in a kind of new strategic restraint gets you all the way back to the beginning in order to justify that move at the end. And it's not the only thing that you do with the book, but one is getting a justification for a new thinking of foreign policy. And that is done in terms of a tradition that needs to be rethought, not taken away, but rethought. So you want to mobilize varieties of that tradition for the best of where the United States can go, because you cannot start anew, right? A strategy always follows up on a particular historical lineage. But my question here is, to what extent is exceptionalism part of the solution? and not also part of the problem. There's one component in the book where you write, we need to get isolationism, but in a sense without unilateralism. And unilateralism you define in two ways. One is the classical, it's the go it alone. But the other one is to be free to choose, not to be entangled by anything that could control or get control over the autonomy of choice of the United States. And that second one is a hard one to swallow for an international order. And so one would need to have an isolationism, if I understand you correctly, that would be able to get rid of, or at least to have a better understanding that the US will need to make the deals with the other, in which it will curtail its sovereignty. It will need to pool its sovereignty because there's no other way of going about it. And if I understand your exceptionalism correctly, that would be an extremely difficult move to do, because exceptionalism is tied to the idea that we are, as Ruggie calls it, exempted, i.e. the rules that apply, they apply for others. I mean, you give a quote by Obama, which I would like to read because it's an interesting one. He defends the institutions, the multilateral institutions. He says they are not perfect, but they have been a force multiplier. They reduce the need for unilateral American action, increase restraint among other nations. It's the restraint among other nations that multilateralism is about. And he says it normally, and maybe he thinks also that, of course, the US should be restrained. But I remember when he came out saying exceptionalism, of course, the US, all countries think of themselves as being exceptional, and he was called back afterwards because you couldn't give up the idea of the US as being exceptional, and that therefore also exempted to some extent from the rules that others would see applied to themselves. And I'm wondering whether, if it is true what you say, that this is somewhat part of the DNA of American thinking of foreign affairs, that there is this strong tension that if it isn't overcome, isolationism will be a solution of the world order that serves the US. But I'm not sure whether the US can with it serve the world order. So that we need to think about what that might entail actually for the US, because you say, and I will end on this and give you time to respond, and I think it's an incredibly interesting part in the beginning of your book. You say that what mattered most for isolationism's role and longevity was a conception of American exceptionalism that equated the success of the American experiment with geopolitical isolation. And then comes, isolationism is best understood not as a matter of policy, but as a matter of national identity and creed. And I think isolationism here stands in for a certain vision of exceptionalism at the same time. It is a vision of its national identity and creed. And if so, it is not easily changed. And you need indeed to go back to the early stories of when this identity and biography has been built up in order potentially to change it. And my big question about this is, to what extent can exceptionalism in this regard be part of the problem for the legitimacy that the US might have in international affairs for its story, because it will at some point need to defend its economic interests abroad. It will push that strongly in order to keep the goodies back home. And it will at the same time then not wanting to play by the rules that have to be played by the others, and therefore undermine its very attempt, so to speak, to isolate.
Thank you for those fascinating comments. On the housekeeping issue, you know, in general, the United States has prospered through what I would call a more laissez-faire model of development. The one area where I think, or era in which that was not the case was the New Deal, when Roosevelt really did cobble together a domestic consensus behind a much more heavy hand of government. And We saw in the 19th century big debates about this. You know, the Monroe Doctrine was the most kind of well-known part of that presidential speech, but a lot of it was about domestic investment. It was about canals and railways and the Navy, and it caused a huge firestorm, in part because this was seen as too much intervention in the economy. And so I guess one of the big questions I have going forward is, in this current era of polarization, will Biden be able to convince Congress to take the necessary steps to deal with the housekeeping agenda? Because that housekeeping agenda is enormous. It really does have to do with worker retraining. It has to do with investment in green technology. It has to do with things that will require government intervention, more spending on infrastructure and R&D. And I don't know whether that's going to be possible. You know, the best guess is that the Republicans will retain the Senate. We're already seeing how difficult it is to get a pandemic stimulus through on a bipartisan way. So yes, you know, we've seen these housekeeping calls before, but I think that today's housekeeping is bigger. It's a higher hurdle than we've seen throughout many eras in American history, with the possible exception of the 1930s. And I don't know whether that the kind of libertarian political culture that continues to hold, particularly among Republicans, will be able to permit that kind of domestic investment. If not, I do fear that the polarization and the illiberalism and the angry populism are not going to disappear anytime soon. On I mean, I think you're right, Stefano, to sort of say, does the debate need to be contaminated by this dirty word? And isolationism is a dirty word. And this goes back to one of Rasmus's initial questions. And you know, I sort of insert this into the debate in part to try to restore what I would consider a kind of the searching quality of the discussion that we need. We still live in a world in which people who say, well, let's get out of here, let's get out of there, are called isolationists. That is starting to change, but we, you know, especially in Washington and the foreign policy establishment, pulling back, retrenchment has yet to become kind of politically fashionable. I see it happening. As we speak, I can feel the debate beginning to change, but it's happening in an incremental way. And you know, we've actually been watching Trump literally having to fire his advisors, whether it's Bolton or Mattis or Esper, in some ways because he has said, I want out. They have said no. And the clash has led the president of the United States to fire his top national security team. So in some ways, this is a debate that's being played out before our eyes. And I think Biden is going to be going through the same debate, because he does have around him a set of advisors who hail from the liberal internationalist tradition. He hails from the liberal internationalist tradition, but he's also the president of the United States and he's a politician. And so I think it will be fascinating to see how this plays out during the Biden presidency. You are right that economically, the United States has not been isolationist and benefits from being internationalists from the beginning. But I would point out, going back to the very earliest days, the 1776 model treaty that was approved by the Continental Congress, the founders basically said, enriching ourselves through foreign trade and geopolitical detachment go together. Why? Because if we play geopolitics and we get involved in the balance of power, it will only impair foreign trade. It won't advance foreign trade. And to some extent, we're seeing right now a situation where rivalry with China is to some extent cutting against a globalized international economy because of supply chains, because of Huawei, because of 5G. And so you can have an American grand strategy that is focused on retrenchment geopolitically, but robust trade internationally. And in fact, the two might go together. But this is something that we'll have to see play out in the days ahead. Finally, you're right to point out that exceptionalism is both the solution and the problem. I'm someone who believes that the United States has, on balance, played a positive role in international history. It has pushed the world in the direction of more liberty, more freedom, more dignity, more prosperity. And so I would not want to see the US abandon its sense of exceptionalism. I think it also helps the country stay together. It's a narrative that helps Democrats and Republicans work together. But I do think that you're right to point out that as part of that narrative, there is a very stiff-necked unilateralism. And that unilateralism is in many respects getting stronger. It is not abating. It was in many respects the strongest element of Trump's America First. And, I would point out that the Senate rejected the League of Nations, not because of isolationism, but because of unilateralism. Because the Republicans, the internationalist Republicans, said, we will not allow the president, Woodrow Wilson, to sublimate American sovereignty to the will of the council, the Great Power Council of the League of Nations. That sentiment is very strong today. Do I think that you will be able to get treaties ratified with 2/3 of the Senate anytime soon? No, I do not. And so what I'm guessing we will see under Biden is something that looks a lot like what Obama did, and that is multilateralism light. Multilateralism through executive agreements, multilateralism through concerts and coalitions of the willing. And that's because anything more formal is not likely to be able to pass muster with Republicans. And it seems to me that the question before us is, will Biden be able to say to the electorate that by rejoining the Iran deal, by rejoining Paris, by rejoining the WHO, which I'm doing not with Senate ratification, we're making the United States a safer and more prosperous place. We're contributing to global public goods. I think the answer to that from an objective perspective is yes, because on all of these fronts, the United States cannot address global problems alone. The issue, coming back to what Vibeke said, is there will be an alternative narrative out there coming off from Fox News and coming from Breitbart and coming from Trump and coming from others on the right wing, is that these are bad bets for the United States and they violate American sovereignty. That debate is not going to go away, and we're going to have to see who wins it. Trump has made clear that is a narrative that continues to have considerable traction among a wide swath of the American public.
Yeah, that comes back to your earlier point as well, that Biden would need to have an economic recovery, infrastructure, and so on in order to appease, in some sense, the electorate that allows him, therefore, to go off for a multilateralism light. This said, of course, for the allies or for anyone else, if any new president can simply take the country out of the treaty that the last one had just signed up because it didn't pass the Senate or anything else, will undermine credibility in international affairs, and everyone knows it and everybody can see it. So the difficulty is how can, as I say before, when I was taught in France in the early in the 80s, I was taught that the United States had a basic idea of its exceptionalism, which would express itself in isolationism and interventionism, and that it was a pendulum that could not be overcome, because isolationism at some point would run against the economic interests, which would at least at some point also mean more interventionism, which then would lead to overstretch and would return, and the pendulum was there always to be. So maybe it's the French education, but there was a sense that if one doesn't retune the underlying exceptionalism, redefine it, which is, I think, therefore the reason you go back to the early days, you will find yourself in this pendulum time and again, and weaker every single time it is happening. But we have as well questions from the audience. So so it's about, I think there have been a couple of questions which I think I have to some extent tried to integrate, namely to what extent, oh, well, maybe let's take the first one. Would going back to internationalism be beneficial, really international? Or would we just be standing in for a West-wide component, i.e. would it be basically a defense of the Northwest without taking too much into account other actors that come up and the global South, but also a more multipolar system perhaps at large? Is it opening up for a world that is plural, or is it basically still trying to have a Pax Americana which is singular?
I think that the one of the things that I take away from the experience of the last couple of decades is that the West, as to use a term that's loaded, is the West. That is to say that there were many scholars, and I would not put myself into this category, but my friend John Eikenberry and others, who really did believe that the order that the US and Europe together built after World War II was universalizable, and that the Chinese and the Russians and others would take their place in that order. And I think that, number one, that was naive. And it hasn't happened. And number two, that order is now sufficiently internally fragile that we have our work cut out for us, just making sure that its liberal and democratic foundations are secure. I don't think we have the time or the energy to be focused on making sure that Saudi Arabia moves in a significant way toward liberal democracy. And secondly, as speaking as someone who has realist leanings, the world has changed too much. The balance of power has shifted. The United States and its democratic allies no longer represent the majority of global GDP. China will be will have the world's largest economy by the end of this decade. And so we just have to be sober about the implications of those shifts in the underlying balance of power. And so there's no question in my mind that we are headed toward a world of geopolitical and political diversity and pluralism. And the question before us is, will we be able to manage that transition peacefully. And also coming back to your the point that you raised, Stefano, at the beginning of your last comment, will there, is there going to be a kind of revival of a US-led coalition given the unpredictability of American politics? And I don't know the answer to that. I guess I would throw it back to you, since you're all European. I mean, I'm guessing that Denmark and others will welcome Biden and breathe a sigh of relief that the United States is back, but at the same time, hedge your bets, because you never know how long this will last, and whether the United States can be seen as a reliable actor. But I'll throw that back to all three of you.
We will have a last round where I invite both Vibeke and Rasmus to come back so they can answer on it. Of course, it would presuppose that Europeans are able to get their guts together and have a strategy, which is already a courageous statement to start. But I have another question from the audience, which is about China. How do you assess US interests in cooperating with Europe in facing China's military threat in the South China Sea or about Taiwan? So what would the US expect from Europe to obtain a liberal alliance, if it wants to have one indeed, against China, Russia and Iran? And I mean that there's a part of your book in which you say that the Chinese have learned the book by the Americans, basically building up a kind of independent hemisphere in Asia, and there's only a question of time when there might be some, when containment is no longer possible. So the question is, short term, do you think that there will be a kind of common policies with Europe, or should there be, versus China, not just in terms of trade and commerce or economics, but also in military terms? And on the long run, are you supporting, I mean, the argument that you made at the end of your book that China is playing the same playbook that the Americans were playing in the beginning, and will at some point be the regional power over Asia?
I think of the issues that are on the transatlantic agenda, managing China will be one of the hardest. We've already seen divisions over 5G and Huawei. We've seen divisions over AIIB during the Obama administration. That's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the United States has geopolitical equities in the Asia Pacific and the Western Pacific that Europeans do not. And so, I think there will be difficult conversations about this. And especially as Europe recovers from the pandemic and tries to get its economy going, there will be strong incentives to keep open the trade and the financial and the investment with Asia and China in particular, and that could lead to some tensions. So I guess the first thing I would say is that I would encourage Biden and his European counterparts to start very early to have a dialogue about China and trying to keep the United States and Europe on the same page. I also think that Europeans have become more skeptical of China, at least that's my sense, over the last year, initially kind of welcoming the Chinese assistance to Italy and others on the pandemic, but then feeling that Chinese diplomacy was too heavy-handed. But as I sort of survey the issues out there that the United States and Europe will have to deal with, I think China will be one of the harder ones, especially if Biden continues the rather confrontational approach that Trump adopted. Finally, Stefano, to kind of answer your question. And I guess this also comes to the question of the reliability of the United States as a partner. At some point, and I don't know when it will come, I would guess that South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, others in the Asia Pacific will begin to tilt a little toward China, simply because China is continuing to grow and countries ask questions about the reliability of the American commitment. We know from history, in the case of the United States, that one by one, extraterritorial great powers gradually withdrew. I would think that at some point we will see a Western Pacific in which China is either the more dominant power or a co-equal power. That seems to me to be unavoidable. And the question in my mind is how do we get there? How do we get there peacefully? And that's where I think diplomacy, dialogue, engagement between the United States and China with the help of Europe is going to be particularly important.
Thank you, Charles. Let's hope Europeans are up to it. I give a last opening, maybe in the inverse order. First Vibeke and then Rasmus. Vibeke, you are mute. Vibeke.
Sorry, you can hear me now, right? Yeah, well, I haven't prepared any sort of closing remarks, but I've got 3 words here saying critical hangover and fishbowl that I'd just like to return to. Because Charles, naturally you ask about a perspective from Europe. And I think as someone who would like to flag that I never really left the critical credentials completely behind, and also I think have realist leanings. I think it's important to understand that what's happening today isn't just, I mean, what's the revolt against liberal internationalism doesn't just have something to do with military overstretch or a globalization that have left a certain part of society behind, or geopolitical changes that means a rising Russia or China just doesn't make the kind of liberal order feasible anymore. I think that the founders' sort of initial fears that eventually a republic becomes an empire, and that could be true of part of Western Europe too, that it overstretches moralistically, that it falls too much in love with its own moral ideas and believes itself infallible. I think that some of the reaction against the liberal order today has to do with progressives, realists feeling hungover, that we all fell in love, or large parts of our societies and political spectrum fell in love with a moment of hegemony. And then just doesn't believe necessarily that this was the right solution to export democracy in the ways that we did. I honestly think we should question that and not just return to the fold, even if Biden had the possibility of sort of just restoring things from where Bush left off. And that's where the fishbowl comes in, I think. I think you said, Charles, that many Americans have been living in a fishbowl that basically only thinks that the 1945 to 2020 or 2012 moment was all that there is. I think we need to expand our horizons more than just looking further back into our own histories. We also need to understand, if we're to sort of deal with the global challenges that we're now facing, what governance, what democracy looks like from some very different parts of the world, and understand the histories of those parts of the world. And there, I think we have a lot to learn, the Europeans too. And that's probably all that there is time for from me, if Rasmus is to have a go as well. Thank you, Charles.
I'll be very brief. Just to say, I think, Charles, that your assessment of the European reaction to the US election is correct. relieved, but also hedging our bets going forward. The only thing I want to point out is, of course, to always remember that there is no such thing as a European position, right? And that we do experience quite different reactions across different European countries, most notably probably between Northwest and East, but certainly also even within those two groups. So just to keep in mind both the reaction towards the US, but certainly also the willingness to confront China along with the US. It really varies a lot from country to country in Europe, I think. But yeah, that'll be the last for me. I just want to once again say thank you very much for a fascinating book.
Charles, any last comments you would like to add?
Just really to thank you, Stefano, and Rasmus and Vibeke. It's been a fascinating discussion. I appreciate all of you taking the time to read the book, and obviously you engage the arguments deeply, and I'm very, very grateful for that. So thank you all for taking the time. Thank you for hosting this. I look forward to the day when we can gather in person to continue the conversation. I have to say this pandemic Zoom thing is growing a little bit old, but I guess it is the best that we can do for now. But I really do hope that we can continue the conversation in person. I guess Copenhagen would be the best place to do it.
Yeah, thanks. The invitation is still live. So in the moment that it would be possible, we will be very happy to have you over in Copenhagen and to have you over for a seminar and a little bit more, maybe offering something more in return than just a smile on the screen. But thanks very much, Charles, for joining. Thanks very much for making the time available. Thanks very much, Rasmus and Vibeke, for making this possible as well. And I hope everyone in the audience could follow nicely, and will have the opportunity to do so on our YouTube channel. So afterwards, if ever you want to double check some of the arguments and come back to it, please don't hesitate. If you want to contact any of us at DIIS with any of the questions that you still have, again, don't hesitate. We are there for that. So thanks again. Thank you to everyone. And I wish you, well, in Europe, a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.